with the trouble in Ukraine? Because I mean, Ukraine has traditionally been the breadbasket of Europe, correct?
Yes, Russia and Ukraine, they supply 25% of the world's wheat, and it flows out essentially from the Black Sea, Odessa, and the Krim Islands. And, the largest importer of wheat from Ukraine and Russia is Africa. Number one country is Egypt.
Mm.
And you have to see, as someone, okay, I want to clarify this point of view. I am a beneficiary of the money printing of the last 40 years. This has not distracted my mind from being one of the very few people who has consistently criticized the Federal Reserve for printing money, because based on history, the money printing is a curse that in the long run has lots of very negative implications on a society, on the wealth distribution, and on the economy. But anyway, that aside, the increase in food prices is going to hurt the poorest people the hardest. You know, I was having dinner tonight with someone, and he owns a restaurant, and he said now he pays for 30 eggs, 110 instead of 90. I mean, I said, I eat 30 eggs in like 3 months, so it doesn't matter. And the price of rice in Thailand hasn't gone up a lot. But for poor people, if the price of wheat goes up or down, it has a huge impact, because you and I, maybe we spend maximum 2% of our income on food. Maybe we spend 20% on booze or drugs or whatever. I don't take drugs, but on alcohol I spend something. But for ordinary people, 30% of the income is probably spent on life necessities. These are things like food, energy, and heating in winter time, and cooking oil, and coal for the cooking oven, and so forth and so on. So 30% goes there. So when the price goes up, they have less money for other things, including education. And I think on a moral ground, one of the worst things that can happen in life is that you impoverish the most vulnerable classes of society. In a free market, like we talked about it before, we can have abuses and so forth. But over time, they are corrected by the market. But if you have deliberate money printing by central banks, and I give you an example. In Spain and say in the Netherlands, in Holland, both countries have announced their inflation rate currently running, consumer price inflation, running at over 10%, okay? The ECB, run by Mrs. Lagarde, she was convicted and on the way to jail, but then somehow, you know, politicians, they never go to jail because they have a different legal system than for ordinary people. But anyway, she is the head of the ECB. Because in politics, when you're corrupt and very corrupt, you get promoted.
Absolutely.
So this is just the way it works. And so she, until recently, she claimed, oh, there's no inflation. Then she said, oh, it's just a transitory phenomenon. Well, this has been building for years because interest rates were always so far below the cost of living increases. You understand? You had zero interest rates, the government expanded, fiscal programs expanded, deficits expanded, everything, which is inflationary. But inflation is a funny thing. Bernanke said, well, we can draw dollar bills onto the US. Yes. What you don't know is where the dollar bills will flow to. So they float to, say, stocks, and they float to the real estate market, and properties went up and so forth. But rising property prices is also negative for most people, because most people don't own the properties. And then it depends when property prices, when interest rates go up, then the burden on the household also increases in terms of mortgage payments, and the taxes go up, and so forth and so on. So in general, I would say we are faced in the Western world. By Western world, I define the most developed countries of Europe, Japan, and Australia, Canada. We're faced for the first time in, say, 150, 200 years with a generation that earns less and has less wealth than their fathers. This generation, the millenniums, and the generation Z, is poor and earns less than my generation, the traditional generation, and the baby boomers. I'm born in between.
Yeah, it's definitely shifted. I mean, a lot of kids are living at home still in their 30s and 40s because they can't afford their own place,
They have
etc.
nothing.
Yeah. Now you mentioned food prices going up. Do you think that's going to lead to global instability and food riots, etc.?
Well, we already had. We had in Sri Lanka
Yep.
some riots. They were not only because of food, but it was a contributing factors. We had it in Peru. I think we have today a disconnect between ordinary people and the government that has never existed before. I'll give you an example. In America, some mayors, as you know, they have decided to defund the police. I've never heard a more stupid idea than to defund the police at a time when crime is already high. Chicago is, I wouldn't call it a war zone, but it's not a particularly safe place anymore. And they defund the police, but the Mayor Lighthouse, she has now, for her own security, 70 staff to look after her around the clock. So what you do is, like someone, when this immigration wave came into Germany and into France, someone wrote rightly in the paper, all these refugees coming from North Africa and the Middle East, they're of course not living next to Mrs. Merkel's house. They're in other areas. But Mrs. Merkel is not affected by them. But the people that live in these areas where suddenly you have a majority of Muslims, they may not like it a lot. You understand?
Yep.
That it changes the character of a country. And just recently, I mean, it's a very interesting case. And I think it may cost him a lot of votes, because they have now the elections in France. Yesterday, or 2 days ago, someone broke into the house of a farmer, okay? The farmer is alone at home with a 3-year-old daughter. But anyway, so they broke in, and the farmer, rightly, he grabs his gun and shoots at them, and he shoots one who dies, and the other then take off. Now, he was arrested by the police for having shot someone. He was released on bail or whatever. And Macron then came out and said, oh, this man is a criminal because he shot someone. He should have called the police. Now, I want you to visualize. You sit in your bedroom or your living room, the 4 intruders that come in. Your little daughter of 3 years sits there. And you, in this situation, you should tell the intruders, please wait a minute, I need to call the police.
It
No,
is absolutely absurd,
simply,
Mark. It is
you
absurd.
grab your gun and you shoot at one of them.
Yep, no doubt about it. Yeah, I think this kind of comes back to the government moving away from protecting private property. You know, I mean, it's the same kind of philosophy where our property and life do not matter to them anymore.
I tell you, for me, this is the thing I've been thinking about in the last 3 weeks the most. You have, say, assets, and traditionally you would say to someone, well, you know, you need to diversify stock, bonds, commodities, properties, collectibles, and so forth. And you need to diversify geography, so you invest some in Asia and some in the US and some in Europe and some in Latin America, something like this. Now, the question is, well, if you invest in Asia and in America and in Latin America and Europe through the same custodian, and the custodian is in the US, and you don't get the vaccine, and the US says, we're not going to freeze your assets, what good is the diversification for?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, I guess you have to diversify your flow-through points of your assets as well.
I think the world, I mean, Biden, he claims that he united NATO. I'm not so sure about that in the long run, because every war is always popular in the first 30 days. But afterwards, you know, people start to think twice about why it happened and so forth. And some people then gradually wake up. It's not black and white. My sense is that, having seen the expropriation or the seizure of assets of the oligarchs, a lot of well-to-do people will think, well, I may not like India, and I may not like Asia, and I may not like China, but maybe it's better to have the custody of some of my money, or have some of my money physically outside the Western alliance, which is from the Far East, Japan, Australia, then the US, UK, Canada, Western Europe. Some people will say, maybe I better have some money in Dubai, or maybe in Hong Kong, maybe in Mumbai, in India, and so forth. So I think these are things that the world has been split into, in my opinion, more obviously than before, into the Western, what the world perceives as an arrogant alliance, and the other countries that say, well, we are a sovereign nation, we can do whatever we want.
Would you believe that? I mean, would you argue that that arrogance of the West has been built on the petrodollar, and that era is swiftly ending?
I'm not sure it's built on the petrodollar. I rather think it is built on a geopolitical view of the world, that the US is the divine country because they have democracy, and because they are the well-meaning country. You know, I can tell you
that's how it's been sold in the media. But I think arguably,
yes, 80% of the world doesn't believe that BS anymore. If you go to Afghanistan and you ask about the benevolence of the democracy of the US, then they don't have much understanding for that, neither in the Middle East or in Libya or in Syria or Iraq and so forth. So I think people are very skeptical of that view.
You know, Mark, my view on this is we were up until World War II, but post World War II, we kind of got into this League of Nations, United Nations effort. I mean, you look at Korea, Vietnam; these were all police actions under, you know, world body of the United Nations and such. So I think we've really lost that moral high ground in the post World War II era.
I wanted to say this Ukraine business exposes the hypocrisy of the Western world.
Yeah, I agree
But
completely. Yep.
Nobody ever talked about the millions, and I'm not exaggerating, the millions of people that through the food embargo with Iraq went into starvation in Iraq
Yeah.
and died. I've seen just recently a documentary about Afghanistan, about a small village. This is now not fake news from a Russian propaganda movie and so forth. This is the reality. The people in that village have no money. They have hardly any food. They have no jobs. There's no industries there. So what they do is they sell their parts of the bodies.
Wow.
They let themselves be operated, take out a kidney, or they can't take out the whole heart. But I don't know. They do all kinds of operations there on the spot, and that is then shipped outside Afghanistan. I suspect most of it goes to China. But if it goes to China, it can also go elsewhere. But I'm just saying, there are some really destitute people in the world. And with all these interventions of the Western world, whatever war, a lot of people got hurt very badly. But they never discussed this. But when it comes to Ukraine, when they can paint Putin and Russia in a negative light, they do it. And I just like to also point out, in 2018, we had the World Cup in Russia. Prior to the World Cup, all the Western media were very negative about Russia, and they warned people, don't go to Russia. And then they sold 100 million tickets in America to watch games. So the people are much more friendly towards, or say they're much more open towards accepting that it's not black and white, but the governments and supported by the media, they want to let it appear like black and white. But I don't want to digress too much from the investment implications. We don't know yet exactly what the investment implications are from this war, because it also depends how long it will last. But judging by the Western world's reaction, I think the war is actually not about some small territory in east of Ukraine. It is about taking out Putin and bringing down Russia to its knees. I think that's the issue.
Do you think that's the reason for the sanctions as well? I mean, from my perspective, I think they're going to hurt Europe a lot more than they are Russia.
This will be interesting to see. At the present time, Russia has a huge trade and current account surplus because there are very few imports that are coming in.
Right.
But the sanctions, Russia has been under sanctions for a long time. After 2014, they started because Russia took back Crimea Island, the Crimea Peninsula, which, by the way, is 98% inhabited by ethnic Russian people. But anyway, they were under sanctions. What happened because of the sanctions? Agriculture grew a lot in Russia, and many industries developed a lot. Normally, sanctions have some negative implications, but long-term, rather positive, because then the industries have to adapt and produce goods locally. And just open a map and look at the size of Russia and the borders of Russia with China, with Mongolia, even with North Korea. And then you have the borders with Kazakhstan and the Central Asian republics, and then towards the west and so forth, the Baltic countries. I'd say smuggling is one of the easiest things to do between the whole world and Russia.
Just because it has such a vast border.
It's porous.
Yeah.
You know, especially if you have a friendly relationship with China. And ships, they move around and so forth. You can't enforce. But I'd like to say one thing about the sanctions. About 10 years ago, when I still went frequently to Switzerland and I stayed in a hotel, which was a very unusual place, we used to have every Saturday or Sunday lunch. And one person came, he was disabled. He couldn't walk properly. And he was not very good in terms of his body. I don't know what he had. I never asked. But he was working for a company. There are only 3 or 4 in the world. They make amplifiers for professionals. These are amplifiers for discotheques. And for like you, if you're a music lover, you need special amplifiers, you need special cables, you need special loudspeakers, and so forth and so on. Everything has to be special. And each installation will cost you between, say, $500,000 to maybe 3-4 million US.
Very high end stuff.
He was a specialist for amplifiers.
Yeah.
So they had some clients, some, I guess, oligarchs or whatnot in Russia. And he couldn't sell. He was working for a company. They couldn't sell from Switzerland to Russia. But they could sell to an agent in the United States. And he would sell to Russia.
Oh, okay. There's always a way around, right?
There's always a way.
So now, you know, I know you've said that gold is fairly expensive at these levels. I also know that you think that it's probably a good place to put some money. What are your thoughts on silver, platinum, and other metals?
Yeah, we were just talking tonight about silver, how inexpensive it was. I mean, I wonder, you know, I say it's expensive. How do you measure what is expensive and cheap when you have money printing?
Yeah.
Gold is, in my view, inexpensive compared to stocks and bonds.
And real estate.
It is expensive compared to the price of wheat, corn, soybeans, coffee, cocoa.
Okay.
You understand, compared to other commodities. Oil is cheap compared to gold. And if I look at the weighting of institutions in the gold sector compared to, say, the weighting of institutions in the technology sector, in the gold sector, the weighting is at the lowest in like 50 years. Because the Greens and the politically correct and the cancel culture people and what are not socialists, they told the institutions, we don't want you to own oil companies. We don't want you to own coal companies.
Yeah.
They just banned Russian exports of coal to Europe. No, they have to go and mine again in Europe for coal. It's a wonderful world when you have idiots in governments. What a world.
It's so true. You know, and we're moving into an era where they're exerting more and more influence on the flow of capital and loans to
Yes.
companies. I mean, we have this whole sustainable finance issue that's coming up, another connection to the World Economic Forum, and also corporate governance, where they're going to be judging companies on their I guess it's like a social justice score of the company as well.
Yes,
It's really it's less and less about competency and effectiveness and value.
it's less and less about capitalism and free markets, because let's face it, if it takes so much to produce a battery in terms of Earth's movement and the cost of producing a battery and so forth, and then how do you discard the battery? Then economically, the cheapest is actually oil and gas.
People think that electric cars like Teslas are all green, but I mean they burn a lot of resources to produce and then to charge them. I mean, electricity doesn't come out of the wall, out of thin air. I mean, it needs to be produced by either nuclear or coal. And I don't think that, wind and hydroelectric is enough to charge all the world Teslas if everyone drove one.
Is not productive.
No.
The most productive is nuclear. But the green socialists, this is the one source of energy they have completely banned, sanctioned.
Yeah.
Now, gradually in Europe, the UK, they think, yeah, we have to have some nuclear energy.
Capitalism always comes.
In Germany,
they
shut them down.
Oh, it's crazy. Yeah,
it's crazy.
When you
but
say
these are the people that we have in governments.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
And the corporations listen to these guys.
Yeah. Would you argue that the market always wins in the long term?
Yes.
And unfortunately, we have to suffer through
Unfortunately, in Russia, the market won. But in between, they had 100 years, 80 years of communism.
Yeah, it takes very much too long to win sometimes for our lifetimes. So, is there anything you think that we should talk about or share?
I think a lot of comparisons have been made, and people think this is a correction in a bull market. But I just want to explain in 2 minutes the following. I lived through the 70s. When I started to work, the 10 years treasury was at 6% in 1970. And then inflation accelerated, and we had the oil shock in 73, 74. Oil went from less than $2 to, say, between $9 and $10. And as a result, commodity price inflation accelerated. And food prices went through the roof between 72, 73, because there were some droughts. So there was this food inflation. But after 73, the oil price was steady for a while. It went up higher later on, but food prices came down. Wholesale prices started to go down again, and commodity prices came off. They were still rising, but not at the same rate as before. But by 73, at the top, the prime rate was over 10%, and the 10 years treasury, the 10 years treasury went to a high of 12.91% in 73. Inflation subsequently accelerated until 1980. And then the 10 years treasury went to over 15%, to be specific, to 15.84% in September 1981. Now, at the present time, the Fed, so the inflation today is at the level of 73, 74, but at the time, the Treasury was at over 12%, and now the Fed is debating whether we'll increase interest rates by 0.25% or 0.5%.
Right.
But they haven't tightened, they haven't taken back or reduced the balance sheet. They're still buying assets. The people at the Fed are completely brainwashed. Brain damaged is a better expression. They shouldn't be there. They should be all hanged. But what I want to say, there is an economist, he's still alive. He became famous because he worked out the formula how to calculate the rate, the federal fund rate, to be neutral. In other words, to produce a price level that is essentially steady, stable. So during times of high inflation, it may go up a little bit more than what the rate of inflation is to bring down inflation. And inflation goes negative, it may go down a bit more. Anyway, according to this rule, which is called the Taylor rule, according to economist John Taylor, he was a candidate for the Federal Reserve, but Trump, he chose Powell and not Taylor, because under the Taylor rule now, the Fed fund rate would be at 9.81%. 9.81%.
The world would be very
Yellen
different
and
with
Powell
that.
and all these clowns are telling you, oh, inflation is transitory and so forth.
Well, they all subscribe to modern monetary theory. So,
well, this is you have to see this kind of nonsense is welcomed by Wall Street. I always told all my friends on Wall Street, and I know some of the top managers and so forth of hedge funds and fund management companies, I told, I don't understand. You have good education. You went to Ivy League universities. You know that money printing is no good. But you don't stand up and you never criticize the Federal Reserve simply because for you, the most important is that year for year, assets go up because you get your fees from that. But on moral grounds, this is of course wrong. You should, if you're in that league of money that you are already on Wall Street, everybody's earning well. They should have criticized the Federal Reserve for their easy monetary policies beginning in the 1980s. And you remember, I always said this is a landmark decision. This is the milestone in financial history. The bailout of LTCM.
Yeah, I remember that very well.
1998, because that gave a signal to Wall Street, leverage up. You can do anything. You'll be bailed out.
That ushered in the grand era of moral hazard.
Yes, this is one of the big mistakes that occurred. And it was then used. We had the housing bubble and, you know, criminals, they didn't go to jail.
No one went to jail.
They should have.
And I suspect no one's going to go to jail next time the bubble bursts.